It all started the day I brought the mirror into my home, a relic from a distant relative I barely knew. Its arrival was unceremonious, a simple, unexpected delivery left on my doorstep. The package was heavy, wrapped in layers of old yellowed newspaper, the kind that crumbles to dust at the slightest touch. When I finally freed the mirror from its cocoon, I was struck by its age and the weight of its presence. The frame was ornate, made of dark, almost black wood, intricately carved with the designs that seemed to shift and change if I looked at them too long. It had a large crack running diagonally across the glass, but despite its damaged state, I felt compelled to hang it in my living room, as if the mirror demanded to be placed there, in the heart of my home. From the moment I did, something changed. The atmosphere in the room seemed to grow heavier, the air thick with a tension I couldn't explain. At first I dismissed it as my imagination. Perhaps I was just uneasy about the mirror's unsettling appearance. But as the days passed, the feeling of unease didn't dissipate. It grew stronger, more oppressive, as if the mirror was slowly asserting its dominance over my life. I began to feel watched, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck whenever I was near it, as though unseen eyes were following my every move. Even when I wasn't looking directly at it, I could sense it there, lurking just out of sight, its cracked surface hiding something far more sinister than a mere reflection. The unease soon seeped into my dreams. At night, I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, with vague memories of dark, twisted visions that faded as soon as I opened my eyes. I'd see shadows moving in the corners of my bedroom, hear soft whispers that seemed to come from within the mirror itself, though I could never make out the words. The crack in the mirror seemed to grow wider with each passing day, a gaping wound that threatened to tear open and spill something terrible into my world. One night, I woke up to the sound of glass shattering. My heart raced as I bolted upright in bed, straining to listen. The house was silent. Too silent. Like the calm before a storm. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to stay in bed, but something stronger, a pull I couldn't resist, dragged me out of bed and down the hallway to the living room. As I approached the doorway, I could feel the temperature drop, a biting cold that cut through my pajamas and made my breath fog in the air. The mirror was the source of the sound. Of that I was certain. But as I stepped into the room, my worst fears were confirmed. The mirror was shattered, its once cracked surface now a spiderweb of jagged lines, the broken pieces reflecting the dim light in strange, unsettling ways. But it wasn't just the sight of the broken mirror that filled me with dread. It was what I saw in the fragments. Each shard reflected not my living room, but something else entirely. I saw glimpses of a world bathed in shadows, twisted versions of my home that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. And there, in the largest fragment, was a reflection of myself, but it wasn't me. The figure in the mirror wore my face, but the eyes were wrong. They were cold, devoid of life, and the smile that twisted its lips was a grotesque mockery of my own. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat as the reflection in the mirror seemed to move of its own accord, stepping closer, reaching out as if to pull me in. Panic surged through me, and I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back in my bedroom, the door slammed shut behind me. I could still feel its eyes on me, even through the walls, watching, waiting. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner of my bed, knees drawn to my chest, my eyes locked on the door as if at any moment it would burst open and that twisted version of myself would walk in. The house was silent, but in that silence, I could hear the faintest whisper, a voice just beyond the edge of hearing, calling me, beckoning me to return to the mirror. But I didn't. I couldn't. The mirror had brought something into my home, something dark and malevolent, and I knew, deep down, that my life would never be the same again. The terror had only just begun. The days following that night blurred into one another. each one bringing with it a new layer of dread. I avoided the living room as much as possible, keeping the door shut tight, hoping that out of sight would mean out of mind. But the mirror had other plans. It was as though the very essence of my home had changed, tainted by the presence of that shattered glass and the dark world it had revealed. It started with the small things, subtle, almost imperceptible at first. I would leave a room, certain that everything was in its place, only to return moments later and find something amiss. A chair would be slightly moved, a picture frame tilted, or a door I knew I had closed left ajar. I tried to convince myself that I was simply distracted, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but the changes grew more pronounced. Books began appearing on tables I hadn't touched. Lights flickered without reason, and the temperature in the house seemed to drop without explanation. But the worst part was the mirror. Even though I never set foot in the living room, I could feel its presence, as if it were somehow spreading its influence beyond the confine of the room. I could sense it in every corner of the house, a malevolent force that refused to be ignored. At night, I would hear faint noises coming from the living room, soft creaks, a rustling sound, like someone or something moving around. Each time I worked up the courage to check, I would find nothing out of place. But the air would be thick with the same oppressive tension I had felt since the mirror's arrival. Then came the whispers. They started as a low hum, barely audible. But as the nights went on, they grew louder, more distinct. At first I couldn't make out any words, just a constant murmur that filled the silence. But as I strained to listen, certain phrases began to emerge, fragmented sentences that sent chills down my spine. "Come closer," one voice would say, only to be followed by another darker voice whispering, "We're waiting for you." The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, surrounding me, invading my thoughts, making it impossible to sleep. The dreams followed soon after. They were vivid, more real than anything I had ever experienced, and each one left me feeling more drained and disoriented than the last. In my dreams, I was back in the living room, standing before the mirror, but instead of my reflection, I would see that other world, a twisted, nightmarish version of my home. The walls were darker, the furniture decayed and covered in dust, and in the shadows, I could see figures moving, their forms just out of reach. The reflections of myself, those distorted, twisted versions, watched me from the glass, their eyes filled with malice, their expressions taunting, as if daring me to step closer, to join them on the other side. I would wake from these dreams in a cold sweat, the sense of dread clinging to me like a second skin. Even in the daylight, the images would haunt me, replaying in my mind until I couldn't tell where the dream ended and reality began. Every time I caught a glimpse of my reflection, I would hesitate, expecting to see something or someone else staring back at me. The line between what was real and what was imagined began to blur. I started to question everything around me, every noise, every shadow, every reflection. I became paranoid, certain that the mirror's influence was seeping into every aspect of my life. I began to avoid mirrors altogether, not just the one in the living room. I covered them with sheets, draped towels over them, anything to keep from seeing the twisted world that I knew was waiting on the other side. But the mirror wouldn't let me escape so easily. One evening, I came home to find the door to the living room wide open. The sheet I had used to cover the mirror lying crumpled on the floor. The mirror stood there, exposed, its cracked surface gleaming in the dim light. I froze, a cold wave of fear washing over me as I realized that I had not left the door open. I had not removed the sheet. Someone or something had done it while I was away. And then I saw it, my reflection in the mirror, but not as it should be. My face stared back at me, but it was twisted into a cruel smile, my eyes dark and hollow. The figure in the mirror began to move, even as I stood, frozen, in place. It reached out a hand, pressing it against the glass, and I felt an icy chill spread through the room, seeping into my bones. The figure's lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but the meaning was clear. It wanted me to come closer, to step into its world and leave mine behind. I ran from the room, slamming the door shut behind me, but the damage was done. The mirror had claimed its hold over me, and I knew that no matter where I went, it would follow. The whispers grew louder, the dreams more vivid, and the sense of being watched more intense. The mirror was no longer just an object in my home. It was a gateway, a conduit to something dark and malevolent. And it was only a matter of time before it pulled me in completely. The mirror's influence began to seep into every facet of my life, like an inescapable poison, slowly corrupting my thoughts, warping my perception of reality. My once peaceful existence turned into a waking nightmare, as the boundaries between the ordinary and the grotesque blurred beyond recognition. It wasn't just the house that had changed. I had changed. The mirror had awakened something dark within me, an unsettling awareness that I was no longer in control of my own mind. Isolation became my refuge. Though it offered no real protection, I withdrew from friends and family, making excuses to avoid social interactions. The phone calls went unanswered, texts left unread, and when anyone came to visit, I found myself unable to muster the energy to pretend everything was normal. I couldn't risk letting them see what was happening to me, what I was becoming. I feared that if they saw the cracks in my facade, they would see the darkness growing inside me, a darkness that mirrored the one behind the glass. The whispers, once confined to the dead of night, now followed me throughout the day. They were relentless, gnawing at my sanity, filling my mind with dark thoughts that I couldn't escape. They told me things, horrible, unthinkable things, that no one should ever hear. They spoke of the world behind the mirror, of the twisted versions of myself that lurked there, waiting for their chance to cross over and take my place. They told me that the mirror was a gateway, a door between two worlds, and that every time I looked into it, I was inviting them closer. Sleep became an impossibility. Whenever I closed my eyes, I saw the dark world from the mirror, the decayed, rotting reflection of my home, and the versions of myself that moved within it. They haunted my dreams, taunting me, whispering promises of what would happen if I didn't let them in. They showed me visions of the future, where they had taken my place, living my life while I was trapped on the other side, forever staring out from the mirror, powerless to escape. The lack of sleep took its toll. My thoughts became jumbled, disjointed, and I found it harder and harder to distinguish between reality and the nightmares that plagued me. I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, only to turn and find nothing there. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, even in broad daylight, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the empty house when I knew I was alone. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing, shifting, conspiring with the mirror to drive me mad. In a desperate attempt to understand what was happening, I began to research the mirror's origins. I spent hours poring over old documents, searching for any mention of the mirror or the distant relative who had owned it before me. The more I uncovered, the more fragmented and contradictory the information became. Some sources claimed the mirror had been cursed, a conduit for malevolent spirits trapped between worlds. Others spoke of it as a portal, a bridge to a realm of nightmares. But every piece of information I found only deepened the mystery, leaving me with more questions than answers. I discovered an old journal hidden away in a dusty attic, filled with cryptic notes and frantic scribbles. It belonged to the mirror's previous owner, who had apparently become obsessed with the idea that the mirror was watching him, controlling him. The final entries were incoherent, filled with paranoid ramblings about the mirror stealing his soul, replacing him with a twisted reflection. The last page was stained with what looked like blood, the writing trailing off mid-sentence, as if he had been interrupted in his final moments. The journal should have been a warning, a clear sign that I needed to get rid of the mirror, to destroy it before it could do the same to me. But instead, it fueled my paranoia. I began to question everything, everyone. The journal spoke of people being replaced by their reflections, and soon I found myself scrutinizing everyone I met, looking for signs that they weren't who they claimed to be. My own reflection became a source of terror. I couldn't look at it without feeling a jolt of fear, wondering if it was truly me staring back, or if it was the other version, the one waiting to take my place. The isolation, the lack of sleep, and the constant fear began to wear me down. I could feel myself unraveling, my mind fraying at the edges. I started talking to myself, trying to reassure myself that I was still in control, that the mirror hadn't won yet. But deep down, I knew I was lying. The mirror had already taken so much from me. My peace, my sanity, my life as I knew it. And it wanted more. It wanted me. I was trapped in a labyrinth of my own mind, every turn leading me deeper into the darkness. I no longer knew what was real and what was a product of my imagination. The mirror had become a part of me, its darkness entwined with my soul, and I knew that it was only a matter of time before it consumed me completely. The descent into madness was swift and unrelenting. The mirror's influence over my life grew stronger with each passing day, pulling me deeper into its dark embrace. The line between reality and illusion became a thin, fragile thread, one that I could feel slipping from my grasp. The mirror had become a sinister presence in my home, a malevolent entity that thrived on my fear, feeding off my terror as it dragged me further into the abyss. The whispers were no longer just a background hum. They had become a constant, insidious voice in my head, a chorus of dark thoughts that I couldn't escape. They told me things I didn't want to hear, things I couldn't possibly know. They spoke of the world behind the mirror, a world that was slowly merging with mine. The twisted versions of myself that I had seen in the mirror were no longer just reflections. They were real, tangible beings that existed in the shadows, waiting for their moment to strike. My house, once a sanctuary, had turned into a labyrinth of horror. The walls seemed to close in on me, the room shifting and changing when I wasn't looking, trapping me in a nightmare of my own making. I would walk into the kitchen to find the fridge in a different spot, or enter the bathroom to discover the sink had moved. Every corner of my home became a potential trap, a place where the other versions of myself could be lurking, ready to pull me into their world. I started to hear footsteps behind me, soft and barely audible, but unmistakable. They followed me everywhere I went, growing louder when I was alone, quieter when others were near, as if taunting me. I would turn around, expecting to see someone, or something, but there was never anyone there. Yet, the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, never left me. It clung to me like a shadow, dark and suffocating, whispering that I could never escape. The reflections in the mirror grew bolder, their presence more pronounced. I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows that danced just beyond my vision. When I forced myself to look directly into the mirror, I would see them, the other versions of me, moving independently of my own reflection. They mimicked my actions, but with a sick, twisted mockery that left my blood running cold. They would smile when I was frowning, their lips curling into sinister grins. Or they would stand perfectly still when I was moving, their eyes locked onto mine, filled with a malevolent hunger. Sleep became a distant memory. Whenever I closed my eyes, I would see their faces, twisted and distorted, grinning at me from the darkness. I began to hear their voices, not just in my dreams, but in the waking world as well. They whispered promises of what would happen if I didn't let them in, if I didn't give in to the darkness. They told me that the mirror was a doorway, that the only way to escape the nightmare was to step through and join them on the other side. I started to hallucinate, seeing things that couldn't possibly be real. The walls would bleed, dark, viscous liquid seeping from the cracks and pooling on the floor. Shadows would stretch and grow, taking on monstrous shapes that loomed over me, their eyes glowing with a sinister light. The air around me grew thick with the stench of decay, the scent of something rotten, something dead. I could feel the darkness closing in on me, suffocating me, dragging me down into the depths of despair. My body began to betray me. I would look at my hands and see them twisting, warping into grotesque forms, the skin peeling back to reveal bone and sinew beneath. My reflection in the mirror would do the same, but with a sick pleasure, as if it enjoyed watching me suffer. I could feel the other versions of myself, those dark, twisted reflections, getting closer, their presence more tangible with each passing day. They were no longer just shadows in the mirror. They were in the house, moving through the walls, slipping through the cracks, creeping closer with every breath I took. The fear was overwhelming, an all-consuming terror that left me trembling, unable to think, unable to act. I was trapped in my own home, a prisoner of the mirror and the horrors it had unleashed. The darkness inside me grew stronger, feeding off my fear, warping my thoughts until I could no longer tell what was real and what was just another twisted illusion. I started to lose track of time, the days blending together into a never-ending nightmare. I would find myself standing in front of the mirror without any memory of how I got there, staring into the darkness, feeling it pull me in, feeling the other versions of myself reaching out, their cold, dead hands grasping at my soul. It was as if the mirror had become a black hole, sucking in all the light, all the warmth, leaving nothing but cold, empty darkness. I could feel it pulling me closer, its grip tightening around my mind, my heart, my very being. I was losing myself, piece by piece, to the darkness, to the twisted reflections that watched me with hungry eyes. The world outside the mirror was fading, becoming a distant memory, replaced by the nightmare that had taken root in my mind. I was spiraling, falling deeper into the abyss, with no way to claw my way back to the surface. The mirror had claimed me, body and soul, and I knew that it was only a matter of time before it dragged me completely into its world. A world of darkness, of terror, of endless, inescapable fear. The day came when I could no longer ignore the reality that I was living in a waking nightmare. The mirror had become a riddle that consumed every waking thought, a puzzle that demanded to be solved, even as it threatened to unravel my very existence. I knew, deep down, that the mirror held the key to everything that was happening, but every attempt to decipher its secrets only led me deeper into a labyrinth of fear and confusion. The whispers that had once been a mere nuisance had evolved into something far more sinister. They no longer simply murmured in the background. They now spoke directly to me, taunting me with half-truths and riddles that I couldn't decipher. "Find the truth," they would hiss, followed by a mocking laugh that sent chills down my spine. "But beware, for the truth will find you." I became obsessed with the mirror, spending hours in front of it, studying every inch of its cracked surface, searching for clues hidden within the intricate carvings of its frame. The carvings, once a tangled mass of abstract designs, now seemed to shift and move of their own accord, forming symbols and patterns that I couldn't understand. I would trace the lines with my fingers, hoping to unlock some hidden message. But the more I searched, the more the patterns eluded me, slipping away like sand through my fingers. The reflections continued to torment me, their presence growing stronger, more tangible with each passing day. They no longer merely mirrored my actions. They began to move independently, their twisted forms acting out scenes that filled me with dread. I would watch, paralyzed with fear, as they mimicked my daily routines, but with a cruel, malevolent twist. They would smile when I frowned, laugh when I cried, and their eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, seemed to hold a malevolent intelligence, as if they knew something I didn't. It wasn't just the reflections that tormented me. The dreams had become unbearable. Every night I found myself trapped in the world behind the mirror, a twisted, decaying version of my home, where the walls oozed with black bile, and the air was thick with the stench of death. The other versions of myself, those dark, twisted reflections, would be there watching me, waiting for me to slip up, to make a mistake that would allow them to drag me into their world forever. I would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. But even when I was awake, the sense of dread never left me. I knew that the mirror was more than just a piece of glass. It was a portal, a doorway to something far darker and more terrifying than I could ever imagine. But how could I close it? How could I stop the nightmares from spilling over into my reality? I began to scour the house for anything that could help me understand what was happening. I tore through old letters, dug through forgotten boxes in the attic, searching for any clue, any scrap of information that could explain the mirror's power. I found fragments of a story pieced together from old journals and letters, a story that spoke of a curse, of a family secret buried deep in the past. The mirror, it seemed, had once belonged to a woman accused of witchcraft, a distant ancestor who had been executed for her supposed crimes. But before she died, she had cursed the mirror, vowing that her spirit would live on within it, waiting for the day when she could return and exact her revenge. But the story was incomplete, the details hazy and contradictory. Some accounts claimed that the mirror had been destroyed long ago, others that it had been passed down through the generations, each new owner falling victim to its curse. There were tales of madness, of murder, of disappearances that had never been solved. But none of them offered a solution, a way to break the mirror's hold. Every lead I followed only deepened the mystery, adding new layers of fear and uncertainty to an already unbearable situation. The mirror seemed to mock my efforts, reflecting back my growing desperation. The more I tried to understand it, the more elusive the truth became. It was as if the mirror was alive, toying with me, twisting my mind until I could no longer trust my own thoughts. The whispers became more insistent, more demanding, urging me to give in, to stop fighting and accept my fate. "You cannot escape," they would say. "The mirror has chosen you." My mind became a battleground, a war between the part of me that still clung to reality and the darkness that the mirror had awakened. I would sit for hours, staring into the mirror, trying to decipher the meaning behind the twisted reflections, the shifting patterns, the cryptic whispers. But the more I tried to understand, the more the mirror's grip tightened, squeezing the life out of me, crushing my sanity beneath its weight. The tension in the house became suffocating, an oppressive force that pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every sound a sign of impending doom. The mirror was always there, lurking in the background, a constant reminder that the nightmare was far from over. I knew that I couldn't go on like this, that I needed to find a way to end the horror. But every attempt to understand the mirror, to solve the enigma that it presented, only led to more questions, more fear, more uncertainty. The truth, it seemed, was just beyond my reach, always one step ahead, taunting me with its elusiveness. And so I continued, trapped in a nightmare of my own making, searching for answers that might not even exist, knowing that the mirror was watching, waiting, biding its time until I finally gave in to the darkness. The night the truth finally revealed itself was the night my world shattered completely. I had reached the end of my rope, my mind frayed beyond repair, my sanity hanging by a thread. The mirror had consumed every part of my existence, and I knew that the only way out was to confront whatever malevolent force it harbored. But nothing could have prepared me for the horror that awaited me when I faced the mirror for the last time. It was late, the hour when the world is at its darkest, and the silence in the house was suffocating. The whispers had been growing louder throughout the day, urging me, taunting me, daring me to finally face the mirror and uncover the truth. My hands trembled as I approached the living room, the cold air biting at my skin, sending shivers down my spine. I could feel the weight of the mirror's presence even before I entered the room, an oppressive force that made it difficult to breathe. As I stepped inside, the air grew thick with a palpable tension, as if the very walls were closing in on me. The room was dimly lit by the weak glow of the moon filtering through the curtains, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to writhe and pulse with a life of their own. The mirror stood in the center of it all, its cracked surface gleaming ominously, as if it were waiting for me. I hesitated, fear clawing at my insides, but I knew there was no turning back. I had to confront whatever was on the other side of that glass, no matter the cost. I took a deep breath and stepped closer, my reflection growing clearer with each step. But as I neared the mirror, I realized with a sickening dread that the reflection staring back at me was not my own. The figure in the mirror wore my face, but it was twisted, distorted, a grotesque parody of myself. Its eyes were dark and hollow, empty voids that seemed to suck in all the light around them. Its mouth twisted into a cruel, mocking grin, and as I watched in horror, it began to move independently of me, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. It raised a hand, and I felt a cold, icy grip wrap around my throat, choking off my breath. I gasped, reaching up to claw at the invisible force, but my hands found nothing. The reflection continued to smile, its grin widening as it watched me struggle. I could feel its cold fingers tightening around my neck, squeezing the life out of me, and in that moment, I knew that it was trying to pull me into its world, to take my place in this one. Desperation took hold, and I fought back with every ounce of strength I had left. I reached out, pressing my hands against the glass, trying to push it away, to break free of its grasp. But the mirror's surface was cold and unyielding, trapping me in place, refusing to let go. The reflection leaned closer, its eyes boring into mine, and I felt a surge of terror unlike anything I had ever known. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, filling my mind with a cacophony of voices that drowned out my thoughts. "Let go," they hissed. "Let it in. Embrace the darkness." I could feel the pull of the mirror growing stronger, the force of it dragging me closer to the glass, closer to the world that lay beyond it. My vision blurred, and I felt a cold, suffocating darkness closing in around me, pulling me under, drowning me in its depths. In that moment, I knew that I was losing the battle. The mirror had won. I could feel myself slipping away, my consciousness fading as the darkness consumed me. The reflection in the mirror grew sharper, more real, as if it were stepping out of the glass and into my world. I could see its eyes now, clear and bright, filled with a malevolent intelligence that sent waves of terror through me. And then, just as I was about to give in, a blinding light filled the room. It burst from the mirror, shattering the darkness and sending the reflection reeling back in agony. The grip on my throat loosened, and I stumbled back, gasping for breath, my vision swimming. The light grew brighter, more intense, filling every corner of the room with a searing white glow that burned away the shadows and sent the whispers fleeing into the void. I collapsed to the floor, my body trembling, my mind reeling from the intensity of the experience. The light slowly began to fade, and as it did, I dared to look up at the mirror. The reflection was gone, the glass shattered into 1,000 pieces, each shard reflecting a different angle of the room. But the oppressive force that had filled the room was gone, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence. For a moment, I thought it was over, that I had somehow won, but then I saw it, a single shard of glass lying on the floor, still intact. It reflected nothing but darkness, a void that seemed to stretch on forever. And in that darkness, I saw it, the twisted reflection, watching me, waiting. It hadn't been destroyed. It had merely retreated, biding its time. The horror of that realization hit me like a physical blow, and I knew, deep in my soul, that the battle was far from over. The mirror might have been shattered, but its power remained. The darkness was still out there, waiting, watching, and it would come for me again. In the aftermath of the confrontation, my life descended into a haunting and oppressive silence. A void that was somehow even more terrifying than the relentless torment I had endured. The mirror, now shattered into countless pieces, had left behind an eerie calm, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next inevitable horror to unfold. The sense of dread that lingered in the air was suffocating, a constant reminder that the nightmare was far from over. I spent hours sitting in the living room, staring at the shards of the mirror scattered across the floor. Each piece reflected a distorted image of the room. But it was the single shard still intact that held my attention. It lay in the center of the chaos, its surface dark and impenetrable, like a window into a bottomless abyss. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it, no matter how hard I tried. It was as if the darkness within it was calling to me, whispering secrets that I was too afraid to understand. Days turned into nights, and I lost all sense of time. The house became a tomb, a prison where the walls seemed to close in around me, trapping me in a perpetual state of fear and paranoia. The silence was maddening, a constant oppressive force that pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside sent my heart racing, my mind conjuring images of the twisted reflection lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. Sleep was no longer a refuge. When I closed my eyes, I was pulled back into the darkness, the twisted world behind the mirror that had become all too real. I dreamed of the reflection, its hollow eyes staring at me with a hunger that defied comprehension. In my dreams, I would find myself standing in the center of the room, surrounded by the broken shards of the mirror, each one reflecting a different version of myself, some twisted, some monstrous, all of them staring at me with that same malevolent grin. But it wasn't just in my dreams that the darkness found me. I would catch glimpses of it during the day, reflections in the windows, in the polished surface of the kitchen table, in the gleam of a knife's blade. They were fleeting, but unmistakable. Brief flashes of that twisted, monstrous version of myself, the one that had come so close to pulling me into its world. I would blink, and it would be gone, but the terror remained, burrowing deeper into my mind, eroding what little sanity I had left. The house itself seemed to change in subtle, unsettling ways. Rooms that had once been familiar now felt alien, as if the walls had shifted, the spaces between them stretching into something unrecognizable. The light was always dim no matter how many lamps I turned on, casting long, distorted shadows that danced on the edges of my vision. I began to feel as though I was being watched, not just by the twisted reflection, but by the house itself, as if it had come alive, feeding off my fear. I tried to leave once, but the outside world felt even more terrifying than the house. The streets were empty, the sky a dull, oppressive gray that seemed to press down on me from above. The familiar sounds of the neighborhood, the distant hum of traffic, the chirping of birds, were gone, replaced by an eerie silence that felt unnatural, wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness had spread beyond the mirror, infecting everything around me. I turned back, before I had even reached the end of the driveway, my fear of the unknown outweighing the horror that awaited me inside. As the days wore on, I began to notice something else, something far more disturbing. The darkness within the shard seemed to be growing, spreading outwards like ink in water. It moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, creeping across the surface of the shard, consuming the light around it. I could see shapes moving within it, twisted forms that seemed to writhe and contort as they struggled to break free. The darkness was alive, and it was growing stronger. It wasn't long before I started hearing the whispers again. They were faint at first, barely audible, but they grew louder with each passing day. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, a guttural, inhuman voice that sent shivers down my spine. I could feel them in my mind, probing, searching for a way in, trying to break down the last of my defenses. The whispers told me that the darkness was coming for me, that it would consume me, body and soul, unless I did something to stop it. But what could I do? The mirror was shattered, the reflection trapped within its shards, but the darkness was still there, still growing, still waiting. I was terrified to touch the shard, to disturb the darkness that festered within it, but I knew that I couldn't just leave it there. It was only a matter of time before the darkness broke free. before it consumed everything I knew, everything I was. In a moment of desperation, I grabbed a hammer from the garage and returned to the living room, my heart pounding in my chest. The shard lay there, pulsing with a dark energy that made the air around it hum with tension. I hesitated, my hand trembling as I raised the hammer, the whispers growing louder in my mind, urging me to stop, to let the darkness take me. But I wouldn't let that happen. With a scream of terror and rage, I brought the hammer down with all my strength, shattering the shard into 1,000 tiny pieces. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The air was still, the house quiet, and I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, it was over. But then I felt it, a cold, creeping sensation that started in my chest and spread outwards, freezing my blood, numbing my limbs. The darkness hadn't been destroyed, it had been released. The pieces of the shard lay scattered on the floor, each one reflecting a different angle of the room. But in the center of it all was a void, a hole in reality where the darkness had been. It was growing, expanding outwards, consuming the light, the air, everything in its path. I could feel it pulling at me, dragging me towards it, a relentless force that I couldn't resist. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was my reflection in one of the tiny shards. It was smiling, its eyes gleaming with triumph as it watched me fall into the abyss. The darkness swallowed me whole, pulling me into an abyss where time and space lost all meaning. I was weightless, floating in an endless void where there was no light, no sound, only the suffocating presence of something vast and malevolent, pressing in on all sides. I could feel it probing at the edges of my mind, testing the limits of my sanity, as if it were a predator toying with its prey, before the final fatal strike. But just when I thought the darkness would consume me entirely, something changed. A flicker of light appeared in the distance, faint and far away, but unmistakable. I reached for it, desperate for any sign of hope, and as I did, the darkness began to recede, slowly pulling away like a retreating tide. The light grew stronger, closer, until it enveloped me, blinding in its intensity. I felt a jolt, a sudden wrenching sensation, and then I was falling, tumbling through the void, the light spinning around me in a kaleidoscope of colors and shapes. When I finally landed, it was with a force that knocked the breath out of me, leaving me gasping on the cold, hard ground. For a long moment, I lay there, too disoriented to move, my mind reeling from the sudden shift. But as the haze began to clear, I realized that I was no longer in the void. I was back in my living room, lying on the floor amidst the shattered remnants of the mirror. The room was exactly as I had left it, the furniture in its place, the curtains drawn against the night. But something was different. The oppressive atmosphere that had filled the house for so long was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt almost normal. I slowly pushed myself up, every muscle in my body aching from the effort. My head throbbed and my thoughts were jumbled, but one thing was clear. The darkness was gone. The mirror had been destroyed, and with it, the twisted reflection that had haunted me. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could breathe without the weight of fear pressing down on my chest. But as I stood up and surveyed the room, a deep, unsettling sense of unease began to creep over me. The silence was too perfect, too complete, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I glanced around, half expecting the darkness to come rushing back, but there was nothing. Only the soft ticking of the clock on the wall and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I forced myself to take a step forward, then another, until I was standing in front of the remnants of the mirror. The pieces lay scattered across the floor, tiny shards of glass reflecting the dim light from the overhead bulb. I stared at them, searching for any sign of the darkness, any hint that it might still be lurking. But all I saw were fragments of my own reflection, distorted, but unmistakably mine. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was quickly followed by a deep, gnawing doubt. The mirror was gone, but the sense of unease remained, like a splinter buried deep in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I was missing something important. I turned, slowly, scanning the room, my heart pounding in my chest. Everything seemed normal. But the more I looked, the more I realized that normal was the problem. The furniture was exactly where it had always been, but it felt off, like it was slightly out of place, just enough to make me question my memory. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper, darker than they should have been, and the light from the overhead bulb flickered faintly, as if it were struggling to stay lit. The air was cold, colder than it had any right to be, and there was a faint, almost imperceptible scent in the air, a scent that I couldn't quite place, but that filled me with a sense of dread. And then there was the mirror itself, or rather, the lack of it. The shards were there, but the mirror, the entity, the presence that had haunted me, was gone, as if it had never existed. But that was the problem. I couldn't remember how the mirror had looked before it was broken. I couldn't recall the details of its frame, the pattern of its carvings, or even the exact shape of the crack that had run through it. The more I tried to remember, the more the details slipped away, like sand through my fingers. It was as if the mirror had erased itself from my mind, leaving only the vaguest impression of its existence. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog from my thoughts. I needed to get out of the house, to leave before the unease took root and grew into something more. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A glint of light from one of the shards, reflecting something that shouldn't have been there. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly I bent down, peering closer at the shard, my heart pounding in my chest. It was small, barely the size of a coin, but in its surface, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was my reflection, but not the one I expected. The face staring back at me was mine, but it was twisted, distorted, just like the reflection that had haunted me before. The eyes were dark and hollow, the smile a cruel mockery of my own. And as I watched, the reflection moved, its hand reaching out, fingers brushing against the surface of the shard, as if trying to break free. I stumbled back, my heart racing, but the shard remained still, the twisted reflection locked within its tiny prison. But the unease that had plagued me since the mirror was shattered now blossomed into full-blown terror. The darkness wasn't gone. It had simply been contained, hidden away in the smallest of fragments, waiting for the moment when it could escape.